Inuma ilu awilum ublu dulla izbilu shupshika. Shupshik ili kabitma, dullum kabitma achapshakum. Rabutum anunaku sebettam dullam ushazbilu igigi. Anu abushunu sharu malikshunu kuradu enlil, kuzalu shunu ninota ugalu shunu ennugi.
Those were the opening lines of Atrahasis, read by Klaus Wilke for the University of London's Department of Languages and Cultures of the Near and Middle East. And it serves as an introduction to a text in a way that reminds us this is a voice from another culture. It's a voice from the past. It's a very foreign voice telling a very foreign type of story. And it also reminds us that the form of the story is not necessarily the kind we're used to going to in order to find the contents of a story. We are used to opening a novel, whether it's Harry Potter or Moby Dick, and having a text that was written by one author as a whole. The text itself has a beginning, middle, and end. Everything fits together. There's a reason for everything that we read. There's nothing that wanders off. There's no repetitions that, no description of a story that stops and then restarts. And because of that, when you opened Myths from Mesopotamia and you read Atrahasis, you probably found that this is not what you're used to. This is not what you expect a story to look like. And the reason for that is that this text did not come through the usual sort of process of authorship that we're accustomed to. The version you have, most of what you read from Dali's text comes from an old Babylonian version that was inscribed into clay tablets in cuneiform by someone identifying himself as Ipik Aya. But Ipik Aya was not the author. He did not create this text. Most likely he was a scribe, possibly a scribe in training, someone who was just learning to write cuneiform. And the way you learn to write cuneiform is the way you learn to write your alphabet, except cuneiform is a much, much more complicated system of writing because it's not just 26 letters that you have to learn that you can recombine to make a small range of sounds. It's something that, as I mentioned last time, is evolved from a pictographic script where a word or a letter stands for an entire thing. A letter is a word. And this changes. It starts to take on phonetic sounds so that you could recombine those individual letters standing for sounds, but it's still a much larger range of images that you have to learn to be able to inscribe into a tablet. So the way you do that is by copying somebody else's writing. And you don't just want to copy a text of a manifest for a merchant ship or something like that. That would be boring. You copy a story that's enjoyable and a story that's popular. And one of those stories is this story of these three disasters that befall this one person, and this person has help from from his patron god, Enki or Ea. And it seems that Ipik Aya was actually transcribing this as an exercise. And we're going to see later this becomes very important because this is one of the ways that stories like this end up being found all over the Middle East. The same story in one or two or three identifiable narrative forms will be found over a wide range of area. The same area where we find cuneiform writing, that style of writing, we also tend to find the same stories. So Ipik Aya is writing this text, the one version, the OBV, the Old Babylonian version that you have in your edition. He's taking this story from somewhere else. He's transcribing it. He's doing us a great service by preserving it. And he's also helping us to identify when he's writing. And this is something very few fragments of any of the cuneiform texts, unfortunately, do for us. But because he says at the very end of the text that this was written by the hand of Ipik Aya in the month of Ayar in the year of Amisaduqa, was king. He's telling us that he's writing during the reign of King Amisaduqa, and we have enough court records in cuneiform that we can identify that Amisaduqa was a king during somewhere between 1702 and 1682, before the Common Era, BC. So he identifies about when he was writing, and he identifies what he has written, the physical objects, the tablets that he has written. And this is very helpful because remember that these are found all in fragments. The cuneiform texts that are fired in clay could potentially last forever. They won't erode, but they are found in collapsed libraries and they're shattered. So we have to find the bits and pieces, and we never find all the pieces. Like with any glass or porcelain or anything you've ever shattered, you know you're never going to get all the pieces. So he helps us out not only by preserving some text, but even what we've lost from him, we know how many lines might be missing in one place or another, because he tells us that he's just completed the third tablet of 3 tablets. That third tablet has 390 lines on it. All 3 tablets together have 1,245 lines. So we know when the text was written. We know how many lines total would have been in all those tablets, and we have the majority of what he wrote, and we, at least by having those numbers, know how many lines are missing. But as I said, he's not the original author. There are older versions of this text that are just less complete. And they're all a little bit different, and not only different wordings, but sometimes different sequence of events, different names for the main character, and that sort of thing. And that's because this story, like most of the stories that we're going to read, in fact, almost all the stories that we're going to read in this class this semester, come from oral tradition. They're products of writing, but the stories themselves predate the narrative, sometimes by centuries. And we know that these types of things happen because there have been oral storytellers up to the present day who are able to remember entire epics, things that would, highly frustrate us if we tried to remember. It takes a whole lifetime of training, learning line by line a particular narrative. And we know that these weren't just recited the way we might recite poetry, but they were sung. We have the texts themselves show indications of things like musical refrains, where the same few passages will be read or sung over and over again, the way you would not expect in prose. You wouldn't really expect in narrative poetry unless it was something that would be like a chorus in a song. You like the chorus, you want to hear it over and over again. You don't actually want to read the same passages over and over again. That combined with the fact that we find the lyre, L-Y-R-E, a term for a type of harp, we find this in the archaeological excavations of Mesopotamia, and we find it has a really important place in that culture. The picture below me here on the bottom left is from the Standard of Ur, which is a beautifully designed lapis lazuli work of art that shows a lot of things having to do with life in ancient Ur. But one of the things that it features prominently is this guy holding a harp. And you see that the harp has this sort of bull head on the front of it. That dates from 1,000 years, or almost 1,000 years, before Ipik Aya writes Atrahasis. So this is something that is part of this very old culture. Now, we don't know what they were seeing on these harps. We know these harps were very important. They're buried with royalty. They're immensely ornate and such that we know this is an extremely important object. And that tells us that what it was used for was an extremely important part of Mesopotamian culture. But as you can imagine, in oral tradition, things aren't going to stay the same all the time. Word for word is going to be easier if it's a song. You can remember the lyrics to a song better than you can remember a speech that you have to memorize. But even that's going to change over time. And perhaps due to that, we have different versions of the Atrahasis story. About the same time period that Ipik Aya is writing, and a little bit before, we have tablets describing a similar series of events, but the main character is named Ziusudra, and he is also the king of Shuropak. He is also a priest of Ea, which, remember, is the name of Enki in other cultures. So, if you take a look at the map in the background on the bottom right, in Uruk, Enki might be referred to as Ea, whereas in Shuropak he might be referred to as Enki. The same god, but slightly different stories, slightly different concept of him from one city to the next. Well, Ziusudra is probably the same sort of thing. His name literally means he of long life in ancient Sumerian. And remember, Sumerians come along before the Akkadians. Ipik Aya is Akkadian. He's writing the Old Babylonian version of Atrahasis in Akkadian, so it's a different language. And the names will be a little bit different, but also some of the events are a little bit different. And these tablets tell us that there were different stories that weren't just different in time, but they were being carried in slightly different culture. The culture up the river was telling the story slightly differently at the same point in time. So confronted with all these different versions, we tend to ask, well, which one's the real one? Which is the original? Or at least, we try to create a composite ourselves. That's why it's important to go back and remember the difference between a story and a narrative. The story is the event or the sequence of events that I'm telling about, but my telling is itself the narrative. I am narrating what happened. What happened is the story. What I'm saying or what I'm writing is the narrative. And we tend to think of a narrative as coming from some original version, either an actual event or at least an original text. And if I think of a text as having an original, like there was one original Atrahasis story or one original definitive edition, authoritative edition, that's something we call an text. Not in everyday language, but when we're talking about how narratives work. If I had this idea that there's a single original text that preserves the real or genuine story, and that all later versions derive from that, I'm thinking of an text. But what we find is, however far back we go, however many new pieces of fragments of these tablets we get, we don't get closer to an original, we actually get more diversity. We get more different versions instead of getting closer to a single authoritative one. And so we should actually think of these as, the story at least, as multiform. That is, there's not just one version, there's all these different story elements that any individual narrator or writer can choose from in order to tell one iteration of a story. And iteration is another term that will help us sort of figure out how this works. You know the term reiterate. If I say something over again, I reiterate it. Well, each individual time I say that thing, that is one iteration. So an iteration is one particular narration of a story in a text, a song, a play, a movie, an illustration, or whatever. Sorry to throw more terms at you. I promise the whole semester won't be like this. Once we get this toolbox of conceptual terminology down, you'll be able to use that for the text for the rest of the semester. But there's a steep learning curve right here at the beginning. Now, as literary theorist Porter Abbott says when defining narrative as opposed to story, he says, we never see a story directly. We never just know what is happening or what has happened. Instead, we always pick it up through narrative discourse. In other words, other people speaking or writing or singing about this thing. The story is always mediated. Mediated meaning there's some conveyance. We don't have direct contact to the story. It's coming through media. Media is plural. We use the phrase or the term to talk about the news media, but that term is plural. It doesn't mean just one news outlet, one newspaper, one news channel, but all of these different sources trying to tell the same story, giving different narrative versions. So the story is always mediated by a voice, a style of writing, camera angles in movies, actors' interpretations in movies or on stage. Even when we're watching something, we're still we're having it framed. So that what we call a story is really something we construct. So it's happening in our heads. We're taking different versions, different presentations, trying to put them together to create what we think is the version, but what we're actually doing is creating yet another version in our own heads. But he says, but most stories, if they succeed, that is, if they enjoy an audience or readership, do so because they have to some extent successfully controlled the process of story construction. So it's not just a free-for-all. If you and I hear the same story, we might have slightly different versions of it, but we don't have wildly different versions of it. In other words, sometimes we see the thing that Frederick Bartlett noticed in the Story of the Ghosts lecture. I talked about Frederick Bartlett and his memory experiments. He would have the Chinook story read to a Cambridge student in Britain, and the Cambridge student would change certain things. And he says, when a story is passed from one person to another, each man repeating it as he imagines what he has heard from the last narrator, it undergoes many successive changes. And that much we kind of predict. I tell you a story, you tell somebody else that story, they tell somebody else that story. It changes each time. But he says, just like the definition I just read, at length it arrives at that relatively fixed form in which it may become current throughout a whole community. So it eventually sort of stabilizes. It just doesn't just sort of diverge out of control. But the important part is within that community. So when you leave the Chinook community, in the Bartlett example, and you go into the Cambridge University in England community, that's when these huge changes take place. So we have to be sort of aware that when a story jumps from one culture to another, it's going to change. Which is why we want to focus on, try to use people within that community as authorities, even if we don't really understand the story we're telling. So, for example, if you take a Native American story, if you have to choose between a version that comes from an anthropologist and a version that comes from another member of that Native community, you want to privilege the one of the Native community. They're going to understand the context. They're going to interpret it more like their source is going to interpret these things. That's the ideal. But what we tend to do is a little bit of both. We take 2 different sources or 50 different sources of a particular story, and we put them together in our own heads, in our imaginations. When we do this in a text, remember, we'll call this a redaction, when you take, multiple source texts and combine them into one text. But even before we actually try to do that, we actually do it in our own heads. Well, I heard this version from of the War of the Ghost from a Cambridge student. I heard this version from this Native American writer. And even though I might want to say the Native American writer probably knows it better, in my actual memory, they tend to kind of converge. I tend to take bits and pieces of one and bits and pieces of the other, and I might forget which one was the source for a particular detail in that text. But that's just a natural way we absorb stories. We don't necessarily remember one version from another version from another version. We combine them all into our own versions. And this is what we're going to call, in this class, a myth. Now, the word myth has a lot of different definitions, a lot of different applications. The term, or the word myth, comes from the ancient Greek word mythos, which meant more than just what we typically think of. The myths weren't just about, Zeus and the gods and that sort of thing. One use of it was just a word or a speech or something you say in public, something you say in a conversation, or the thing you talk about, the thing you say, the fact that you relate, not the fact itself, not the object in a scientific sense, but your description of it. So if somebody says, I don't know, but I heard, whatever, and then they tell you something, that's the kind of thing that was typically referred to as mythos, as a myth. And it's not something that's necessarily false. Like when we have the show Mythbusters, we talk about, we call something a myth, that means that it's false. But it's without the distinction of truth or falsity. I don't know for sure, but here's what I've heard. That's that kind of thing. So it might be in the form of a story that's told not something you have to believe exactly as I tell it, but also not the assumption that it's wrong, the assumption that there might be some truth to it. You don't really go beyond that before you just relay this narrative version of a story from one person to another. But of course, in Atrahasis, we have what looks like the thing we typically define as myth. That is, we have gods, they're creating the world, they're fighting with each other, and we probably don't assume that there's much truth value in this story. We probably don't assume that there was an actual god named Elil, and there was a god named Enki or Ea who helped this guy, Atrahasis. So we look at it, frequently people will say things like, art is the lie that tells the truth, or there's truth with a capital T that's more universal than facts. This is actually the kind of thing that would technically classify as a myth. It's trying to tell some general truth by telling facts that aren't quite right. But then we have these kinds of stories about gods and this sort of thing, and I want to distinguish those from other types of myths. So 3 more terms that will help us distinguish that kind of myth. One is cosmology, and a cosmology isn't necessarily a myth. The cosmos is the universe. A Russian cosmonaut is an astronaut. So cosmos is the world we live in, but the world beyond as well. And it's a concept. It's not the actual universe in this sense. It's a concept of the universe. It's a schema of the universe, how that universe looks. And for the ancient Mesopotamians, the universe looks something like the picture on the bottom left. There was the water below the earth. There was water above the earth, above the ceiling of the sky. That ceiling of the sky was held up by the pillars of these tall mountains. And above the, there were these gates in the sky that would sometimes allow water in that water tank out that would fall down into the earth. That would be the rain. That's a schema of how the cosmos is. It's a cosmology. Don't confuse that term cosmology with the term cosmogony or cosmogony. That G-O-N comes from the Greek word genesis, which, by the way, is a Greek term, which means beginning. So this is the beginning of the cosmos. In other words, this is a myth dealing with the creation of the world, how the world came to be. And that's one type of myth, and I want to distinguish that from another type of myth, which is called an etiology. Sometimes it's spelled with an A-E, that's the way I'm going to spell it in here. Sometimes it's just spelled with an E at the beginning. But it's a story about the origin, not of the whole cosmos, but of a particular natural phenomenon or a cultural practice. I'll come back to an example of that in a minute. All right, so that's, I know, a lot to take in. So take a minute and go over these terms, write them down, especially the red letter terms. They're things that you'll need to know for a quiz, but also we'll be applying them to a text. And then when we get to the next video, we'll actually apply those to reading the text of Atrahasis.